Hello, I'm Jonathan Bowman-Perks, and welcome to my favourite time of the week. And as part of the Inspiring Leadership series, I am delighted to have Anita Liu Harvey. Anita is the Director of Global Payment Strategy at Spotify and was recommended by a number of people to be on this series. So Anita, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So I thought the first thing we'd go into is tell us a bit about your current role in Spotify and your career journey into leadership, because we had a good chat about it and I find this fascinating. So please do tell us.
Sure. So I joined Spotify just over a year ago now, and I look after the payment strategy team, and we've got a broad remit. So we cover payments globally for subscribers, for artists, for advertisers. And it's also a really diverse role. So Spotify's in hyper growth still. So every day there's a new idea or a new feature that we need to evaluate. So we're working with teams across different products and different time zones on a daily basis. But if I think back to when my career journey as a leader started, it was pretty early on in my career actually. I think I joined PayPal UK. I think it was my second or maybe third job out of university, so still in my mid-20s, and I was between employee number 10 and 15 in the UK. And back then, PayPal was still very much part of eBay. So we had a handful of desks in the corner of the Richmond office. And back then, eBay and PayPal had a habit of hiring young, pretty inexperienced people like myself who are new, fresh out of university, and saying to them, hey guys, come have a go at growing our UK business from scratch. And, here you go, off you go. And I learned an amazing amount as a leader and as a person during my time there. I think the thing that I learned the most is it's incredible what humans can achieve if you provide a safe and trusting environment for them to work in. If you empower them to do their job, and you don't place any limit on what they can actually do. So personally for me, during my 3 years there as head of business marketing for PayPal UK, I figured out how to do marketing for the first time. And I also launched our first brand campaigns in the UK and established PayPal as a brand in its own right outside of eBay. I hired a team, and I figured out how to manage a team for the first time. And not only that, I built probably one of the highest performing teams I've ever worked with. So it was a really incredible, highlight of my leadership journey, and that lasted for about 3 years. And after that, I think it'd be fair to say that my leadership journey stalled for twice as long as that. So my next two roles after leaving PayPal didn't work out for different reasons. And then not long after I'd accepted the role in the payments business at Barclays, I started my family. And then I started a period of being in and out on maternity leave. And I think, like many mothers returning from having had a child, I lost quite a bit of confidence in what I could do. After a number of years, I remember looking back at my time at PayPal, and it almost be like I was looking at a completely different person. I didn't recognize myself in that way anymore. And if I'm to be honest, I'd pretty much written myself off. And then something changed. So Barclays acquired a company, a technology company, and several of the leaders from the payments business moved over to join that company. And one of them approached me about taking a role within that company. And when he called me up, I remember I came up with a whole bunch of reasons as to why it might be a bit difficult for me to do this role. And there were things like, well, I only work 4 days a week. I'm going to have to leave at 5 every day to pick the children up. And I remember he let me finish, and then there was a pause. And I remember him saying something like, well, I'm struggling to understand how any of this is an issue. And I remember being really surprised by his reaction. But because it was such a non-issue for him, that actually gave me the confidence to take the plunge and to take this new role. And that really was a turning point, because it was a smaller part of the organization. The leadership, shared pretty much some of the same values that we'd had back in the early sort of PayPal days. And I really started to thrive again and to find my old self. And I benefited from having not just one leader, but a set of leaders within this company who really believed in me. They progressively grew my remit and sponsored me and rose my, they trained me and they helped to raise my profile across Barclays. And I think it was only 2 years later that I was promoted to director within Barclays. And if I'm being absolutely honest, that would not have happened, and I wouldn't be sitting here today if I hadn't received that boost and I hadn't had those incredible leaders believing in me at that point in my life.
Who is the particular one, the leader that made the biggest difference? Would you just name them just to recognise them?
Yes, sure. So I think Ed Black was the manager who hired me, and he was probably the greatest coach I had, because he was great at listening and then just offering me a little bit of advice here and there, which I'd go away and think about, and then I think I became a much rounded leader because of some of the nuggets of feedback he gave me over time. And then I'd say Nicole Olby, who was she was such an inspirational leader, and she really championed me across Barclays. And last but not least, Mark Pettican, he's president of Barclays Payments now, but he was leading this business at the time, and he really championed me and sponsored me and put me in front of much more senior people across Barclays, which helped to really raise my profile at the time.
Fantastic. Well, what lovely people to have as mentors and coaches to you. I'm sure they gave you great advice. And looking back now, what piece of advice do you wish you'd had when you first started out after university and you thought, if only I'd known that now, it would have really helped me? What would the bit of advice that you'd share with others be the best bit of advice?
I'd say probably that you don't have to be good at everything to be a great leader. So I for quite some time, I felt that to be able to lead a team effectively, I had to be able to do everything well. And it took me, I think it was actually Ed who taught me this, that actually what you need to do is understand what your strengths are, and then surround yourself with a team whose strengths lie in other areas. And it's by doing that you're building that high performing and effective team where everybody has something very valuable to contribute.
I think that's such good wisdom, and I've had some wisdom which is along those lines, which is surround yourself with an army of giants, men and women who are metaphorically 2 inches taller than you in their specialist areas, which aren't areas that you're so good at. And you'll never work a day in your life because you're enjoying what you're doing, and they're all doing what they love doing. So I think that's great advice. You don't have to be good at everything to be a great leader. We talked about the sort of undulations of life, and that there is no linear life, no linear career journey. Highs and lows and setbacks and disappointments. And as you described, moments in my career, and you described in yours, when you stalled and you weren't making progress, or you doubted yourself, and that imposter syndrome that we all suffer from but few admit to. Though I don't think Donald Trump has imposter syndrome at all, but most normal people do. What's your, in the undulations of your life, what's the proudest moments you've had and the darkest moments you've had in your career journey and your life journey? And picking one of each, what did they teach you in becoming the fine leader you are today that people recommended to come onto this series?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the proudest moment for me was actually probably the proudest moment for my father. So the Financial Times used to do a list of the top ethnic minority leaders, and I think it was 2017. I featured in the top 10 future ethnic minority leaders, and I remember being so shocked that I'd made this list, and also a little bit. I felt a little bit, I guess, embarrassed and about it, and but I think I did it, and I felt proud because my father was incredibly proud, because for him, having come from the background, he was from a very poor background in China. He never had a school education. He'd worked so hard in his life to try and change, the course of my life and my sister's life so that we could have opportunities he didn't have. So I think the proudest moment for me was for him to be able to show his friends that his daughter was featured in this list in the Financial Times.
I just think congratulations on that. And also never forget the power of parents. I've had a number of leaders who've realized that, and they do things like they'll have award ceremonies for their members of staff, but they'd invite the parents or anybody they'd like to have to come along, and they'd give it to them and they'd put it on their mantelpiece. And so when they came to say, I'm thinking of leaving, the parent can't leave there. I've told all our friends how good you are, and we've got this award on the mantelpiece. And so it was almost a glue to stay with this family that cared about them and cared about the parents of these young people. It particularly was a young people group they had in their call center. I just thought that was wonderful. Let's talk about habits. Oh, you were going to talk about a dark moment.
Yeah.
And what it taught you.
So I think, the darkest moment for me was a personal moment when I think, two members of my immediate family have been diagnosed with very serious illnesses in the past. And I think it's probably the darkest moment for me is that immediate moment after you find out about the diagnosis and you don't have all the information and you just don't know what's going to happen. And you just get this sense that life's about to change forever. And what I remember about both those times is that after the initial sort of shock, I found this incredible sense of calm and strength, and I just focused on what I could control. So I would gather all the information, I'd be strong for everybody else, I'd come up with a plan. And I think the key takeaway from me in that is when, there's times of huge crisis or change, is to try and steer people to focus on the things that they can control and to get their strength from there.
It's so true. And it's very much some of the Stoical philosophy and some of the teaching of Lao Tzu and his wisdom from China 2,500 years ago. There's control the controllables. And the thing you can control is your thoughts and your actions. You can't control what others do or what events are going on in the world. It's useful to know the events in the world and all the dramas that are happening. But I make a point of reading Stoic philosophy first thing in the day, not watching the news or getting depressed by events I have no control over. It doesn't mean you don't have empathy for people who are suffering from raging fires in California, but to get so stressed about something you can do nothing about, it's very damaging for your mental health. But equally, if you feel so strong about it, send some money, do some help, do something to help people. But I think that's good advice you brought there. Habits that have made you successful. Most of the leaders we have got a series of habits they have, or bits of wisdom they've received from parents or teachers or people they work with. And we talk about healthy, wealthy, and wise. What would be your tips to share with others about health, wealth, and wisdom?
So I think for health, for me, it's about balance. So I remember a friend of mine telling me in the past about her wheel of happiness, and I was quite curious about this. And she was telling me, she's got, she puts love, family, work, health, in this wheel of happiness. And when one thing's not going right, she leans more on the others. And that really resonated with me. So even during COVID, when I was homeschooling my two kids and working full time and trying to look after the team, I made sure I was going out running every morning, and I use Headspace, the app, and just getting 10 minutes a day first thing in the morning, I think totally sort of grounds me and calms me for the rest of the day.
I'm a great believer in, I have both Calm, which is another app, and Headspace. And twice a day I do mindfulness, and it just so grounds me. The other one is the breathing. There's a whole wisdom, ancient wisdom about breathing, but particularly the tip that someone gave me in one of the books, actually called Breath by James Nestor, is the 4-7-8 technique, where you breathe in for 4, you hold for 7, and you breathe out for 8. But most of it's nasal breathing, but on this occasion you breathe out through the mouth for 8. Doing that a cycle of 4, no more, really just completely grounds me before any call I have. Did it before this session today, and before any meetings I have. And I commend it to you and to others who are listening. 4-7-8 is a great tip. But yeah, so that's a good bit of healthy. What about wealthy?
Yes, we've talked about this earlier. So for me, wealth is relative, and I was explaining to you, my family from a very poor rural background in China. I think just having enough food to survive was top priority, and so going into, I've always had that backdrop, and even when I'm indulging in a nice cocktail these days, I can still hear my mother's voice in the background saying, you've got to look after your money, don't spend unnecessarily. And we will still go to spend Christmas every Christmas with my family, and we still do not know until 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve what we're going to be having for Christmas dinner the next day, because my mother will wait until half an hour before the supermarkets are closing for the Christmas period, and then she'll go in and she'll buy everything at the lowest price possible. So
Oh,
I've had all sorts of unusual shaped turkeys in the past.
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, I love the story. And what about wisdom?
Wisdom. So I think so many things come to mind, but I think regret nothing, learn from everything. It is something that somebody said to me in the past, and I definitely think that's true. I've learned much more and much faster from the things that haven't worked for me in the past than the things that did. And it's something that I think Spotify as a culture really embraces. So you hear about a lot of companies that talk about fail. We take risks, and we fail fast and learn quickly. But actually, Spotify is the first company I've worked at which really embraces that culture. And what really sort of makes it work is that they create a safe and empowering environment for us to take risks. But then the leadership, from Daniel down, they own the decisions with their teams. And I've lost count of the number of times that a senior leader has got up on stage and stood up and said, you know what, we tried this last year, and guess what, it didn't work, but this is what we've learned from it, and this is what we're going to do differently now. It's just absolutely embedded within the culture.
I so love that. And I think it's one of the professors I met at the University of Michigan talked about teachable moments. And when I was in IBM, there's the historic story about John Watson, the CEO, when he took over in the 50s, a long time ago. And one of the senior vice presidents who worked for him came in day 2 and said, there's this enormous problem. He said, and how long have you had it? He said, about 6 months. He said, well, why didn't you tell the previous CEO? I said, well, it was a culture of failure is not an option. Good news culture. You had to just have good news. And so I didn't feel it safe to tell him. So I tried to sort it out, but it's got worse. And said, how much is the loss? And he said, it's $600,000. So he said, I suppose you're going to fire me. And John said, fire you? Why would I fire you? I've just invested $600,000 in your development. I'd like you to go away, think about what you've learned, what action you take, learning and action. It's a teachable moment, and come back with your team and brief me on what you're going to do. He did the next day. They resolved it. They made $5 million from the lessons they'd learned from it. And he became the CEO in turn. And I've never forgotten that. The teachable moments, what have you learned? What are you going to do? And I either succeed or I learn. But even when you succeed, you learn something. Don't you think that's great wisdom that fits with what you've just said, Anita?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so love that. Then let's go on to what makes a good inspiring leader and a good inspiring team in your experience?
So I think for me, it's about, an inspiring leader is a leader who can articulate the why. Time and time again, I've seen leaders explain what we're going to do. We're going to launch, this product. We've got to hit this revenue target. We've got to reduce costs by X%. But they stop short of explaining why, and then you see the disconnect between the teams, and they're struggling to understand, where they fit into the bigger picture. And I think this is where Spotify do it really well. Daniel and team, they spend so much time and invest so much time in explaining why, what our direction of travel is, what our North Star is, and they do it in such a way that the teams can understand how how our goals are contributing to that bigger common goal. And even down to an individual basis, we can all relate to how we're all helping to move towards that North Star. And I think it's incredibly inspirational when that happens.
Completely agree. I think, and one of the things in our psychometric, the Inspiring Leadership Compass, has PQ, purpose quotient, meaning and purpose. What gives your life meaning? Why are we doing what we're doing? What's the legacy going to be is another element, and your values, why you do what you do, why you won't do certain things. But I love Simon Sinek's work on why, and even Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, that very thin book, which is probably worth adding to your list, the ones you'll give out to your team. He talked about Goethe's philosophy, that he who has a burning why can cope with any what or how. But people, the other quote was a lovely one from somewhere else. People who know what and how will always work for the people who know why.
Yeah, I think I'd say that's very true.
Yeah, I love that, the choice of that one. And what about teams? What do you find makes an inspiring team?
I think a diverse team, so where everybody brings something different to the table, and so I think definitely diversity, but also trust. So I think without trust, you don't have a team that's performing well. So for me, that every time I'm working on a new project or I'm pulling a new team together, I'll spend an awful lot of time up front building that trust and investing in that trust and making sure that that's always there.
Yeah. That comes up time and again. There's a whole load of research been done recently on psychological safety and how can you create psychological safety in a team, and then the trust that follows from that. And again, a book which was a favorite of mine, The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey Jr. But the one thing I took from the whole book, and there's lots in it, but is the simple equation: trust equals speed, equals speed times cost. So where trust is low, everything takes an awfully long time and it's very expensive, even gets to legal fees and things because people don't trust each other. And meetings after meetings and meetings before meetings for the meetings and notes and all the rest. But where trust is high in the leaders that I coach and work with, they just talk to someone else to say, can you do that? Yep, leave it with me. And the cost is nothing because it's just such a psychologically safe environment with high trust. Does that resonate for you and your experiences?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what you're saying about trust takes time, but it pays off in the end. Often you'll see people, when new teams are formed, sometimes leaders they'll just rush off and start making a bunch of decisions and moving in the direction of travel, but because they haven't invested in building that trust and taking people on that journey with them, you'll find that it will fail further down the line. So I'm a big believer in put the foundations in place, and without the foundation of trust, you're not going to succeed in the long term.
I think it's so key. And then talking about leaders who build trust and things, if you were to pick a couple of leaders that you found to be inspiring leaders that you'd like on this series and that you'd be recommending were to attend, who would you pick, and what qualities have you admired about them?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned him previously, but Mark Pettican I would definitely pick. He's president of Barclays, of payments at Barclays now, but I think his qualities are that he's a real people leader. I used to remember he used to walk the floors every morning and just perch on the end of people's desks. He knew everybody by name. He knew what they did. He would take the time just to find out on what people were working on that day, and genuinely just help them to see. He was a why leader. It helped to see what they were doing and why it was important to the business. And what I noticed about Mark is he moves around the organisation as he sort of takes new roles, and the people who worked with him previously tend to move with him, and that for me is a true sort of proof that he's a really sort of inspirational leader.
Yeah, that's great, and that so fits with many of the finest military leaders that I've worked for. Exactly his behaviours. And who was the second inspiring leader, and why would you choose them?
Yeah, so I think I'd probably pick Paulette Rowe. So she was in charge of Barclays' payments acceptance business for many years, and then she then left and went to Facebook, and now she's at PaySafe. But I remember Paulette she's a very human leader. So she had a great sense of humour, but I think most of all, she wasn't afraid to show her vulnerable side. And during her time at Barclays, she went through some, quite difficult sort of personal circumstances, and took a bit of time out of the business at one stage. And I remember when she came back, she was very open about what she'd experienced, and she was very open about the fact it's okay to not be okay, and to ask for help. And looking back, I think what I learned from her is that she demonstrated how it's much easier and for people to connect with leaders who show their human side, and to relate to them because they are also human beings.
Yeah. Roger Steer, one of the professors at Cass with me, talks about the three hums: humanity, humility, and humor as being the key for leaders, and you just described that beautifully. Here we are in the middle of wave 2 of COVID-19 in many countries. What's been the impact of COVID on you personally and your life and your work at Spotify?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I think my experience hasn't been, it's been very similar to a lot of working families trying to homeschool two boys at home whilst working full time, both parents working full time. So I've become very skilled at running a workshop while simultaneously, running a math lesson on my right hand side and an English lesson on the other side. So that's been a little bit chaotic, but we've muddled through. I think I've also, for me, it's been a very positive experience from a personal perspective, actually, because I've actually spent more time with my children than I have since I was on maternity leave, and it's been just great to get to know them again and not have to rush around taking them to football practice or to school. So I've really been grateful for that time we've had together. I think from a Spotify perspective, as a team, interestingly, I think by the end of this year, half of the payments team will have joined during COVID. And that's presented some interesting challenges because we were a very close team prior to COVID. Even though we were spread across different countries, we would meet up regularly. And now we don't know when we'll all be together again. And we now have a whole new, half the team are new, and it's finding new ways to connect and to build that sort of team trust and rapport whilst we're all virtual. And we're still trying to figure that out, if I'm being absolutely honest. But
yeah, it's a hard one. And just thinking as you look at stepping back more globally at the whole area of leadership, and what have you picked up as how COVID has impacted the way people lead now, and what you're picking up they might do in the future, and the way the use of offices and going back to office? Do you not go back to the office? And how do you lead a virtual team in the future? Because this is certainly going to go on for a year, 2, 3, who knows? Because it isn't going to be over for a long time yet. People think it is. We're not going to go back to anything. We're going forward to something. But what do you think the impact has been in the way people lead now and will be in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think everybody's still trying to figure that out. I think leaders are still trying to figure that out. But what I do know is, you may have had a way of, you would have had an understanding, you'd have known your teams before COVID, and you would have known how to motivate them, engage them, and support them. That's what I've learned is you just need to start from scratch. So none of that is relevant anymore. Everybody's in their own individual context, and they're all dealing with COVID in very different ways. So I've talked about my personal situation, but there's other members of our team who are living in countries far away from their families. They may be living on their own and potentially be isolated. And there's others who are, they have, relatives that they need to try and get to see. And I think what we've learned is you have to take a step back and get to know each person again in this new context, and also be mindful that you can't see everything that's going on Zoom. So you're not picking up on a lot of those human cues that you get by having that face-to-face interaction. So giving people probably the benefit of the doubt an awful lot more in terms of when they may do something a little bit unexpected, and then finding ways to connect with them, and spending a lot more time, trying to connect with them as an individual rather than working through, what's the next thing we have to do on this project. But it's we don't have all the answers. That would be my advice. Just really, see everything and start from scratch in terms of getting to know the teams.
So true. And you and I were talking before about only 2% of us have actually been trained in listening. And listening is the key, particularly when we're on Zoom like this, and watching for the micro cues in their eyes and maybe the environment they're in, or how's their facial muscles moving. But there's those 5 levels of listening that my friend Oscar Trimboli talks about. Firstly, listening to yourself, clearing your mind of all the stuff that's going on for you. What's going on for you? And have you got a bit of a bias against the person you're listening? Are you really going to listen to them? Or you got stuff going on? Then listening for content in what they're saying, listening to the context they're in. But the lovely question I particularly like is listening for the unsaids. And a great question is, what haven't you told me? That is like the best hack question I've ever come. What haven't you told me? And they just open up on amazing. You go, goodness, I didn't know that at all. So listening for the unsaid, and finally listening for meaning. What does that really mean? Back to the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? I think that's great. Lovely. Top tips from you for leading in a crisis. A couple of top tips leading in a crisis and during change. So this is one pandemic. We're going to get more pandemics coming, and there's going to be more change. There's going to be environmental change. There's going to be food shortage, environmental issues. We're going to have to be ready for a lot. What would be your top tips for leading in a crisis and during change?
Yeah, that's a bit of a gloomy picture you've just painted, Jonathan. But I think I would probably just reiterate some of the, some of the things we've already discussed. So stay calm, focus on the things you can control rather than the things that you can't, and start from a blank sheet of paper and get to know your teams again, and try and understand, how they're responding to the crisis and the change that's going on around them.
Yeah. I think it's so key, getting to know your team again. And you and I were talking before about life stories and how powerful it is for a leader to ask the life story of someone. They think they know, they've worked with them for maybe 10 years. They do not know them. And many leaders don't really get into asking, what's working well in your personal life and your work, which is one of the great, round questions to get a group meaning going, because people start a session and they're talking, the leader, all the time, but other people don't join until they speak. So a great question, 30 seconds, what's working well in your personal work in your life, and just do a round of that. So we're almost towards the end of our conversation, but what mistakes have you seen people making during change, during a crisis, this one and other ones, that really for us to watch out for goodness sake, don't do that. It really didn't work well. What couple of mistakes that you see people making that they should try and avoid? Don't make the same mistakes.
I think trying to be very certain about where we're going, and saying, okay, things have changed, this is what we're going to do. Maybe we're going to all work from home now. I've seen a lot of companies come out and say this, or we're going to switch and this is going to be our new way of working. I think nobody knows what's going to happen, and I think when you're so absolute in saying this is what we're going to do, it makes it harder to change that going forward. So I think it's better to be transparent and honest, and to say sometimes, actually, we don't have all the answers, but here's what we know now, and based on that, this is what we're going to do. I mean, if I'm going to be really honest, we see our government doing this time and time again. They're very absolute about this is going to happen and this is not going to happen, and then we've seen U-turn after U-turn, and what we see is that the public have just lost, they've lost trust, and it's all falling apart, if I'm being absolutely honest.
Yeah, and I've had some wisdom from some leaders that exactly as you say, what they've found has been helpful is to be very honest about, I don't know all the answers. This is such a fluid situation, but I'll update you every week, every day with where we're at now. So bear with me, it will be changeable. We don't know the journey, we can't control it. But I'll give you what certainty I can without being arrogant about it. And they say, this is our vision for the organization, for our team. Set the vision, you can set that. It's almost can be timeless. It's a journey, it's not a destination. But adapt the strategy. And it's almost like people talk about tempo, which is the ability to move fast in that direction and then suddenly change and go that way without losing momentum. So it's a change of direction without losing momentum. And have review points. So this is the decision we're making now, just like you're talking Spotify, that we tried this, it didn't work. So begin something with the leader being the decision evaluator, but the decision makers as low as you can make them. So they're making decisions down there, and then you have a review point to evaluate. Is this still relevant, or has the situation changed? In the military, we used to talk about question 4. Question 4 was always, has the situation changed? If it has, how does that affect 2 up, 1 level up, and my part in their plan? And constantly reviewing that. There's no shame in that, but have a clarity of vision. Does that fit for you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly how, again, our leadership at Spotify have led through COVID. We've had regular updates on this is what we know now, this is how we're preparing for it, but there's been no sweeping statements about this is what we're going to do, this is how we're changing things going forwards, because they're very honest. We don't know. The situation's changing day by day. Here's what we know, and we're going to keep you updated.
Yeah. And another leader who's interviewed recently said in the past they used to have 3 to 5 year strategies, which they'd sort of try and rigidly stick to. He said now we have 3 to 5 week strategies with clear vision, but the strategy adapts because Brexit, whatever it might be, COVID, things change so quickly. What would you like your legacy to be, Anita?
Yeah, I found this a really tricky question. I think what I will say is I'm really passionate about diversity and inclusion, but particularly about inclusion. So I think hiring diverse talent is probably the easiest part. Keeping that and diverse talent and helping them, creating an environment where they can thrive it takes more work. And for whatever reason, maybe it's because of my Chinese background, because I'm a female, I'm a working mother, I'm a northerner, we were talking about that earlier. There's been times where I've been part of a team, but actually I felt on the outside of that team. And as a result, I'm really mindful of ensuring that all the teams that I'm leading, I'm creating an inclusive environment and putting myself in everybody's different shoes to just try and see, how that team dynamic, or, whatever if we're making a decision, if we're organizing a social event, if we're picking a date to hold a meeting, just to see how that would, whether it would work for them. And I guess in terms of my legacy, I hope if, by me doing this and making people think more about being inclusive, if I'm able to drive inclusivity and to help there, then that would be a really happy outcome for me.
Very, very sound. And also remember, you're a steward and looking after 2 boys, and that will be your legacy. The lives they have, you're not responsible for them, but you're taking care for them while they're with you. And my wife Lee and I have got 4 between us, and we are very proud to see them launched, as it were. Now they're in their late 20s and with their partners, but disasters will happen to them, problems will fall upon them as they have on us. And it's not the fact you have a problem, it's how you handle it that marks out the successful from the disastrous. So yeah, I think the other legacy is already your sons, but what happens in their lives, only fate will know. How about your final question, which is what book have you read in the past that you have found useful, and why did you think it was one that people should have a quick read of?
Yes, we were speaking about this earlier as well. So I think quite early on in my career, I think it was probably when I was at PayPal, somebody gave me a book called Who Moved My Cheese by, I think it's Dr. Spencer Johnson. And I rediscovered it a few years ago. And for those who are not familiar with the story, it's a really short story, but it's essentially about 2 humans and 2 mice, and that they live in a maze. And in that maze, their purpose in life is to find their cheese. And cheese is a metaphor for whatever makes them happy in life. And they find that cheese, but then that cheese suddenly disappears one day, and it's really about how they each respond differently to that, to the disappearance of their cheese. And the moral of the story being, change is inevitable, and not to be afraid of it when it happens. We're also talking about, there was a particularly turbulent year at Barclays when I was there. I think we lost 3 levels of leadership in a very short space of time. And at Christmas of that year, I bought each member of my then team a copy of this book. And actually, I connected with one of them again recently, and he mentioned to me that he still picks it up from time to time, and it helps him put the current situation into context.
Well, thank you. And Layla and Philippa both said you were an inspiring leader. You certainly have been. I've taken such a lot, and you've triggered in me other thoughts about advice I've had over the years. So you've got some great wisdom and experience. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure having you on the series.
Thanks, Jonathan.